President Trump initially dismissed a whistleblower complaint from someone in the intelligence community as partisan and fake news. Now the president has changed course, admitting that he did talk to the Ukrainian president about a political rival.
This is a little bit complicated, but let's try to work through it. Multiple news outlets reported last week that this whistleblower's complaint was focused on what they viewed as the president's troubling communications with Ukraine. According to a new report in the Wall Street Journal, the president urged the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden's son on about 8 occasions during a single call. He brought it up 8 times, it was said. The president is now confirming that the former vice president's family did come up during that conversation in July, but he argues this.
I said absolutely nothing wrong. It was perfect.
NPR national political correspondent Mara Liasson joins us this morning. Hi, Mara.
Hi, Rachel.
President Trump says he did nothing wrong, but the concern is that there may have been a quid pro quo here, right? That this is tied to U.S. aid for Ukraine. Can you explain?
Well, the president's critics say that pressing a foreign country, in this case one desperate for U.S. help against an aggressive Russia, to dig up dirt on a political rival is an abuse of power. And they say that if the president, as he is alleged to do, held up congressionally appropriated aid to use as a cudgel over Ukraine, so in other words, he's holding up this aid for his own personal political benefit, that's also an abuse of power. Now, the president, as you said, admits that he did talk to the Ukrainian leader about investigating then Vice President Joe Biden's son. He said at one point yesterday he'd be happy to release the transcript of that phone call. Then later in the day, he backed off and said, well, my aides and I will make a determination about that.
But Democrats aren't so keen on that time frame. They've set a deadline of the Thursday, right? What are they saying?
They want to get the whistleblower complaint. That's what they're trying to get. And even though there is no line that the president would have had to cross for this to be an impeachable offense, more and more Democrats are now talking about impeachment. Adam Schiff, who heads the House Intelligence Committee, close ally of Nancy Pelosi's, the House Speaker, said this could cross the Rubicon. He wants to know whether any pressure was placed on the Ukrainian leader. Here's what he had to say on CNN yesterday.
This would be, I think, the most profound violation of the presidential oath of office, certainly during this presidency, which says a lot, but perhaps during just about any presidency.
Now, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is still being cautious. She says her bar is bipartisan public support in support of impeachment.
Which she has maintained for a long time.
Yes, but she is calling for the Director of National Intelligence to disclose that whistleblower complaint.
Joe Biden, I mean, how's he responding to all this?
He is saying that Donald Trump took these actions to smear him because he sees Joe Biden as a threat. And he says Trump knows that he could, quote, beat him like a drum in the 2020 election.
And we should also say there is no evidence at this point that Joe Biden or his son Hunter, who is working for a Ukrainian energy company, that there is any evidence of wrongdoing. What are you watching for next?
Well, there are 2 big moments this week. On Wednesday, Donald Trump and the Ukrainian president will meet face-to-face at the United Nations meeting in New York, and the acting director of national intelligence is supposed to testify on Capitol Hill to the House Intelligence Committee about the whistleblower complaint on Thursday.
Right. That's that Thursday deadline we mentioned. Okay. NPR's White House correspondent Mara Liasson, thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, so what should be the response to an attack on Saudi Arabia? That is the question vexing a lot of world leaders as they gather in New York this week for the United Nations General Assembly.
For the Saudis, as well as their allies in the United States, the leading suspect in this attack is Iran. And the larger context involves the U.S. confrontation with Iran after the U.S. backed out of a nuclear agreement. We've been talking with Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. Iranian diplomats get very little access to the United States, just as American diplomats can't go to Tehran. But Zarif is allowed a narrow slice of New York during UN meetings. He insisted in an interview with NPR that his country did not attack the Saudis, and he said the attack was not even in Iran's interest.
5 days before our president comes to New York, would we do it so that instead of pushing our own agenda here on U.S. violations of JCPOA, we should be talking about Yemen?
NPR's Peter Kenyon keeps an eye on Iran for us. Hi there, Peter.
Hi, Steve.
So Iran's foreign minister says his country didn't do it. He just alluded to Yemen. He says the real culprits were Houthi faction in Yemen aligned with Iran. But I also asked, would you even know if Iran's military would do this? He said, sure, but you follow Iran, Peter. Would the foreign minister even know?
Well, probably, yes. And of course, we should note Britain now says it's also concluded that Iran was behind this attack. But back to Iran's government, very complicated, very opaque. The foreign minister isn't in the chain of command of the military, nor the president for that matter. But the foreign minister, the president, and the military in this case are all saying more or less the same thing. They're on the same page. Now, we should remember Zarif did resign briefly earlier this year, saying he was being kept from vital information. He now says he is being informed. He'll be in New York with President Rouhani, who will be supposedly bringing forward a peace plan for the region.
Here's another thing Zarif said here in New York.
If the United States attacks Iran, then we will attack, and we have made it very clear that all U.S. interests would be reasonable targets.
Suppose this confrontation did lead to some kind of retaliation. Is Iran in position to damage U.S. interests?
Well, certainly. I would note Zarif referred to retaliation to an actual attack, not a threat, but officials in Iran have been saying for some time now any response wouldn't necessarily be limited to American assets, and going after U.S. interests in the region could perhaps mean a strike against American allies. Now, this is a path both Iran and the U.S. say they don't want to go down. Trump says he doesn't want a war. Iranian leaders say the same, but tensions have been running high for some time now. World leaders do worry that things could escalate with very little warning, and that's why I think some of the talks in New York this week will be aimed at de-escalating the situation.
What are some of those talks?
Well, there'll be lots of discussions. UN General Assemblies are known for that, but in particular, the UK, France, Germany, China, and Russia, the countries left in the nuclear deal, they'll be having a meeting on Wednesday. Not the U.S., of course. President Trump pulled us out of that.
What is the U.S. saying here, Peter?
Well, the U.S. says Iran needs to come back to the table. They need to eliminate what they call their malign behavior in the region. And it doesn't look very likely that there'll be any talks between the U.S. and Iran this week. It's always possible, a quote-unquote accidental meeting, but so far there's no indication of a direct meeting.
Peter, thanks.
Thanks, Steve.
That's NPR's Peter Kenyon.
All right, so we know world leaders are going to be talking about Saudi Arabia and Iran. They're also going to be talking a lot about climate change, which they have done before talk. Now there is global pressure to act.
The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is bringing world leaders together today for a climate action summit, and he's asking for big ideas.
Don't come to the summit with beautiful speeches. Come with concrete plans and strategies for carbon neutrality by 2050.
The meetings follow widespread strikes on Friday where millions of people around the world, many of them students, took to the streets to call for action.
All right, NPR science reporter Rebecca Hersher is following all this and joins us this morning. Hi, Becky.
Good morning.
So today's summit comes just as this new report from the UN's meteorological agency has been released. And this is important. What does it say?
Well, it's not good, as you might guess. It's a summary, really, of all the bad news about climate change. So it's the hottest it's ever been in recorded history, for one. It's still getting hotter. Greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, not decreasing. And that's if you look at the whole world. And it means a lot of dangerous things for humans. So sea level rise, longer droughts and heat waves and cold snaps and more frequent and intense storms. It's harder to grow food. The list goes on.
So we heard the UN Secretary General say, no more beautiful speeches. We got to act. Yeah. So what's the action? What is the goal of this summit?
Basically to push world leaders to make bigger promises. So it's the kickoff to 2020. Under the Paris Agreement, 2020 is the first deadline for countries to look at the promises they've made, reassess, say, is this enough?
Mm-hmm. So do we expect countries to make those bigger promises? I mean, have those initial commitments under the Paris Agreement worked?
Yes and no. On one end, some countries are ready to make bigger promises. France, other European leaders may be ready. India, small island nations around the world, they'll probably signal that they're ready to be more aggressive. China, even, they set quite conservative targets. They may be ready to make bigger ones. On the other end, Brazil, no. Russia, no. The U.S., President Trump has threatened to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and the U.S. is not on track to meet its previous promise. That was to reduce greenhouse gases about 25% by 2025. We are not on track to meet that. The U.S. is not on track, and the U.S. does not appear to be ready to make bigger promises.
We've got to consider what's been happening over the last weeks, right? All these protests, students from around the world. The photos of these walkouts were really amazing. Young people walking out of school or work to draw global attention to climate change. Do you get the sense that there is a greater urgency, not just on the streets with those people, but that it's actually causing lawmakers to think about this in a different way?
It's hard to say. Certainly, policymakers are aware of the protesters. It's hard not to be. There's a lot of anger, a lot of expectation. I think the protests feel big to a lot of people. That said, we're talking about a huge problem that will require massive rethinking of the global economy, and it's just not clear whether the world's leaders are ready to pursue that.
Right. NPR science reporter Rebecca Hersher. Thanks, Becky. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Let's hear from a country that has been a special focus for President Trump.
Right. That country is Ukraine, to which the United States froze vital military aid. Now, President Trump also had a phone call with Ukraine's new president. Trump acknowledges seeking dirt on a political opponent, Joe Biden, though he insists he was speaking against corruption. The Washington Post and multiple other news outlets now come close to connecting these events. They quote senior officials who say the president personally ordered the military aid withheld at least a week before his phone call to Ukraine. In Washington, Democrats are increasing their calls for impeachment.
There is a lot to discuss here, so let's go back a few years and also go over to another continent here with NPR's Lucian Kim, who's in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
Or I should say good afternoon where you are. How are Ukrainians responding as more is known about Trump's actions?
Well, unfortunately, Ukrainians are very used to corruption scandals and are also used to their prosecutors doing almost nothing to go after corruption. In fact, that's one reason why Volodymyr Zelensky, who's a professional comedian, was elected president this year. It was a protest vote against the old way of doing business. As for Ukraine being in the middle of this partisan scandal in the U.S., I think it's unpleasant to say the least. People here see the U.S. as Ukraine's most powerful ally, and it puts them in a very uncomfortable spot to be in the middle of this political firestorm. I've tried speaking to people. Ukrainian officials are not really commenting on this. They want to wait until their president, Zelensky, meets President Trump tomorrow at the United Nations.
And when you say most powerful ally, we should note Ukraine's neighbor Russia has attacked the territory in various ways, and that's why the Ukraine is relying on U.S. support. Now, how did Joe Biden, or rather his family, get involved in Ukraine at all?
Well, Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, showed up pretty much out of the blue in 2014 and joined the board of an energy company run by a former environment minister. Now, hiring Hunter Biden, this was at the time when they were also hiring a former president of Poland to the board, was part of an attempt to give this company some respectability. There were a lot of questions about its owner, this former environment minister. He was being investigated for money laundering, and there were questions about how he obtained his drilling licenses. So the accusations of wrongdoing actually predate Hunter Biden, and hiring him was actually part of this sort of cleanup effort. What frustrated Western countries, including the U.S., and many anti-corruption activists here in Ukraine, was that prosecutors were not investigating this company or basically any other wrongdoing in the country.
Well, what drew the former vice president, the then vice president Joe Biden, into Ukraine?
Well, Steve, the first thing to understand about Joe Biden and Ukraine is that as vice president, he was the Obama administration's point man on Ukraine. He often visited, and it was really part of his brief to monitor the reform process that was supposed to be going on here. Now, the accusation we hear is that Joe Biden tried to use this position to somehow protect the energy company where his son was on the board. I asked Brian Bonner about that. He's the editor of the Kyiv Post, Ukraine's English language newspaper.
Joe Biden, as vice president, did not try to kill the investigation into Burisma. In fact, one of the reasons why the prosecutor general was fired was because he obstructed one corruption case after another. He prosecuted no one for corruption. He protected corruption.
So, Biden's pressure to fire this prosecutor was really in line with what other Western governments were demanding at the time.
Okay, so thanks for straightening out the facts that are part of this story. NPR's Lucian Kim is in Ukraine.
Thank you.
Now, how's all this look from the White House? NPR White House correspondent Franco Ordonez is traveling with the president, who is in New York today, by the way. Franco, good morning.
Good morning.
So what is the president saying to justify his various actions here, and especially that phone call demanding information about the Bidens?
Well, he's been extremely emphatic that he did nothing wrong, but he really hasn't been able to get away from it, even trying to get to New York. In Washington, pressure continues to build. 7 freshman Democrats who are also members of the military, they wrote an op-ed last night in the Washington Post saying that if the allegations are true, they represent a threat to what they swore to protect. As I said, he's been very emphatic. He teased us reporters that he might share the transcript, but he stopped short of doing it, saying that he would do it. He just says it sets the wrong precedent for the calls. We've heard that kind of thing before. I am sure, based on the new reports, that we'll hear about it again today.
Although we should emphasize, the essential elements here are all acknowledged, all in public. The freezing of military aid, that's in public, that is known. The phone call, that is now in public, it's known. That the president asked about the Bidens is pretty clear from the president's own statements. It's just a question of how all this fits together, right?
That's correct.
So stay with us, Franco, because, of course, the president has a big appearance in New York, where you are today. He speaks before the United Nations General Assembly.
Yeah, we should say U.S. presidents have often used this speech, this moment, as a way to emphasize America's leadership role on the global stage. This year's address comes against a backdrop of a trade war with China, insecurity in the Persian Gulf, and also calls for stronger action on climate change.
Plenty to talk about, Franco, so what will the president say?
Well, the president and his staff are being a bit coy about his speech. White House officials say the president will present the U.S. as an alternative to authoritarianism. They'll probably discuss respect for independence of individual members, particularly on national security issues. I was among reporters when he was asked about Iran. That will certainly come up. This is what the president said.
A lot of things are going to happen. Let me just put it this way. A lot of things are happening with respect to Iran, a lot more than you would know, a lot more than the media knows. But a lot of things happening. Okay? I'll be discussing it a little bit tomorrow.
Trump got a boost from Germany, France, and the UK last night. They released a joint statement also blaming Iran for the attack on the Saudi oil facility. President Trump also said yesterday that he's going to talk about the U.S. economy and the global economy.
All right, let's face it. The president, of course, is still a very powerful figure, president of the United States, but also a very unpopular figure globally. Do world leaders still listen to what he has to say?
Well, world leaders certainly listen, but they won't necessarily follow. The reality is American global leadership isn't what it used to be. I spoke with Ivo Dalder, who formerly served as the ambassador to NATO. This is what he said.
Woody Allen once said that 80% of life is showing up. The Chinese are showing up in places where the United States used to show up. And as a result, the Chinese are gaining influence.
The reality is, President has pulled back in many ways from his America First pledge. He's pulled from the Paris Climate Accord. He promised that he wouldn't be president of the world, and we're seeing that.
Franco, thanks.
Thank you.
NPR's Franco Ordonez is in New York City today. A trove of documents in Europe has become evidence against the government of Syria's Bashar al-Assad.
Yeah, these are documents from inside Syria revealing abuse in Syrian prisons. Lawyers and survivors collected these papers, and NPR has gained access to them. Some cases against the Syrian government are now getting to court in Europe. Many of the hundreds of thousands of refugees who've arrived there bring personal stories of the torture they survived.
NPR's Deborah Amos has seen the evidence and talked with witnesses, and she's on the line. Deborah, good morning.
Good morning.
Where do you go to see this evidence?
Well, to get into the offices of the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, or CIJA, you have to agree not to say where the office is. It's a security issue. These are experienced war crime investigators, and they are storing evidence. 800,000 documents, 3.5 tons of paper. All of this official documents smuggled out of Syria over 8 years of war.
Wow.
This February, this paid off. They were part of why the German police arrested a former Syrian intelligence officer who'd slipped into Berlin with refugees. Now, there's going to be a trial, and Bill Wiley, who's the Canadian investigator, he founded CIJA, He says international justice is based on what's called linkage cases.
Because international criminal justice is focused on higher level perpetrators who normally don't get their hands dirty. Those who are known to the public appear in impeccably tailored suits, speak fluent English in the case of President Assad. Ultimately, those are the guys that we're after because they're most responsible for the offenses.
Oh, you say linkage cases because these people might not personally have killed someone, and yet they are participants in or even directing the effort. So you have documents that you've seen relating to these cases, also survivors, right?
Yes, and many of these people are becoming witnesses, and it's restored some hope considering what they've been through. In 2011, there was an uprising. The Assad regime responded with violence, and then they had sweeping arrests. Tens of thousands of people were jailed. They say tens of thousands, and there are documents to show this, were tortured to death. Omar al-Shogri is someone I talked to. He's 24 years old. He was arrested when he was 17 years old. He endured 3 years in two of the worst prisons in Syria.
You can't ask me how many 1,000 times I want to die, but I never want to see how they kill me. I want them to kill me like fast.
But they didn't. He survived. His mother paid an intermediary $20,000 that it saved his life because it got him out. He's now on a mission. He's talking to Swedish war crimes units. He's talking to German prosecutors. He is helping to build these cases against Assad.
Do some of those cases go forward?
Well, last year, the French and the Germans issued arrest warrants for senior Syrian officials. There's this upcoming case in Germany, and what I am told by lawyers and the CIJA people is there's about a dozen mid-level Syrian officials who are in Europe. These are the most promising cases because there is documentation. There are witnesses in Europe. There's 13 European states who are moving on these investigations, and I'm told that they expect more trials to come.
Deborah, thanks so much for your reporting. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Deborah Amos.
After months of hesitating, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is starting a formal impeachment inquiry into President Trump.
The actions of the Trump presidency revealed the dishonorable fact of the president's betrayal of his oath of office, betrayal of our national security, and betrayal of the integrity of our elections.
Betrayal is Pelosi's word for the president's dealings with Ukraine. The president acknowledged asking about a political rival in a phone call with Ukraine's president. His personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, has acknowledged a long-running campaign to find political dirt in Ukraine. Someone in the government who learned of all this has filed a whistleblower complaint, which lawmakers want to see.
There are a lot of unanswered questions here, but here to answer the questions that we can answer is NPR's political correspondent, Scott Detrow. Hey, Scott.
Good morning.
Okay, so this is a remarkable step from Nancy Pelosi. It's one that she has been very publicly reluctant to take. What brought her around?
You know, Pelosi has long believed that politically impeachment should be a last resort measure, something that should not go forward unless there is bipartisan and broad consensus that it needs to happen. But for Pelosi and a lot of Democrats, including, importantly, a lot who changed their mind yesterday, and that includes Representative John Lewis, these reports that the president may have pressured another country to do something for his political benefit and that the military aid may have played a role in all of this, that was just a bridge too far.
We will never find the truth unless we use the power given to the House of Representatives and the House alone to begin an official investigation as dictated by the Constitution.
And there was one more really important factor here, and that was the White House's refusal so far to hand over that critical whistleblower complaint to Congress, and that is something that's required by law.
So if we talk about precedent here, there isn't a ton of it. Only 3 presidents prior to President Trump have faced impeachment proceedings: Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton. What does a formal impeachment inquiry in this case actually mean? What actually changes?
Here's a very straightforward answer. Not much at all changes, and at the same time, a whole lot changes. So let's walk through that. Here's what doesn't change. Several key committees had already been investigating the president for a wide range of issues. That continues. There's no select committee. As of right now, there's no House floor vote on impeachment. Here's what's different. Pelosi is now signaling that she fully backs this effort and that she and Democrats would be comfortable holding a House vote impeaching the president. And announcing this the way that she did yesterday also makes it clear that impeachment going forward is going to suck up all of the political oxygen in Congress. And that's another reason that Pelosi had been so hesitant to take the step until now. There's a lot of things that she wanted to get done, and it's much harder to come together on a prescription drug deal when you're holding an impeachment inquiry.
When there's not much oxygen. Yeah. So President Trump, what is he saying about all of this?
Mostly responding on Twitter yesterday, very similar to how he responded to the long-running Mueller investigation, calling it a witch hunt, saying that Democrats are taking this route because they can't beat him in next year's election. I'll point out that he actually trails most top Democratic candidates in most of the very early hypothetical polls that we've seen of the election. We will hear a lot from President Trump today. He just happens to be on the schedule meeting with Ukraine's president at the United Nations for the first time. He's also expected to hold a press conference, and the president has promised to release a transcript of that key call between him and Ukraine's president.
Okay, so a lot possibly coming down the pike today. Let me ask you about Republicans in the House and Senate who have stood by President Trump at points when you might not have expected them to. Mm-hmm. What are we hearing from them at this point?
One thing that they are pointing out is something we've also heard from the White House, and that's pointing out that Pelosi took this step without actually seeing the whistleblower complaint, without seeing the transcript, without a lot of the key evidence here. Here's what Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy said.
Our job is to focus on the American public. Our job is to make tomorrow better than today. Our job is to legislate, not to continue to investigate something in the back when you cannot find any reason to impeach this president.
Key moments going forward, that possible release of a transcript. We'll also have congressional testimony tomorrow from Acting Director of National Intelligence Joseph McGuire. He's the person who has so far blocked that complaint from going to Congress. And we've also heard that the lawyers for this whistleblower have been in touch with key committees saying that this whistleblower wants to talk to Congress. That could happen soon.
Interesting. Big week coming up. NPR's Scott Detrow. Scott, thank you so much.
Sure thing.
All right, the United Kingdom is having political problems too, to put it lightly. In late August, Prime Minister Boris Johnson suspended Parliament.
He was sued. It ended up in the British Supreme Court, which ruled that the suspension was illegal. Johnson has suffered a succession of humiliating defeats since becoming Prime Minister 2 months ago. He's now flying home early from the United Nations meetings in New York. This all comes with little more than a month until the Brexit deadline. The UK is set to leave the European Union October 31st.
Okay, so now that Parliament is back in session, is there any hope for an agreement ahead of that October 31 deadline? That is a question for John Peet. He's the political and Brexit editor for The Economist. Hi there.
Hello.
So Parliament is back. And what does that mean for Britain's plan to exit the European Union?
Well, Parliament is coming back this morning. It will ask lots of questions of the Prime Minister, but the fact that it's been returned and that its suspension has been ruled unlawful doesn't directly affect the Brexit negotiations that the government is having in Brussels. But it does make it harder for Boris Johnson to secure a deal, and it will therefore raise the question of what happens at the end of October, which is the deadline for Brexit to take place.
Yeah, and what happens ultimately to Boris Johnson, who has taken a lot of hits lately. How did he respond to this Supreme Court decision, and what do you expect him to do now?
Well, as is his characteristic, he responded defiantly. He said he disagreed with the judges. He thought they were completely wrong. He doesn't think he's done anything wrong, despite the fact that the judges have ruled he's broken the law. And he wants to carry on and deliver Brexit. But he's going to find it very difficult because he's lost his parliamentary majority, and there is now a law in place which says that if he doesn't secure a deal with Brussels, he cannot then just proceed to leave the EU with no deal. And he's going to find it very difficult to defy that law.
So where do things stand with his negotiations with the European Union, with Brussels?
Well, I think the gap between the two sides continues to be very large. I mean, it really hasn't narrowed much since earlier in the year when Parliament rejected the deal negotiated by Theresa May. And Boris Johnson is going to find it difficult to narrow that gap in the next 2 or 3 weeks. He still hasn't put a proposal on the table, which Brussels is demanding, for avoiding a border in Ireland. And then there's a crucial meeting in mid-October where he's hoping to do a deal, but I think he may find it very difficult. So my prediction is that it will end up with an extension of the deadline beyond October 31st.
An extension. Okay. Now, in the meantime, opposition parties are calling on Boris Johnson to just quit. Politically, is he safe?
I don't think he's going to resign, and I don't think he's going to be forced out of office, but he has no parliamentary majority, and I think the ultimate solution is going to have to be another election, but it may not happen until the end of the year or even early next year.
John Pete of The Economist, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Our oceans are experiencing a heat wave.
That is among the alarming findings of a United Nations climate change report released today. It finds that the oceans are getting hotter and doing so faster. The report warns that ocean warming ripple through natural ecosystems, affecting national economies and individual livelihoods.
NPR science reporter Rebecca Hersher has gotten a look at this report. She's with us now. Hi, Becky.
Hi.
So why is this report unique, or uniquely worrying, I suppose I should ask?
Well, it's a synthesis of everything we know about climate change in the oceans. It has more than 100 authors. They're from all around the world. And in terms of what we do know, as you said, not good. Climate change is happening. It's happening because humans are burning fossil fuels. As a result, ice is melting faster and faster. Sea level rise is accelerating. The rate of ocean warming has doubled since the mid-1990s. And, this is interesting, this is the first time that a report like this has included really in-depth information about a relatively new phenomenon, and that's heat waves in the oceans. Altogether, that's really bad for sea animals, it disrupts fisheries, and it's happening right now.
Heat waves like we would see in certain cities during the summer?
Exactly. Actually, in the last 7 years or so, this is why it's relatively new, we've seen them, these big, persistent blobs of hot water off the coast of the U.S., and the report says they're getting more frequent, more intense as the Earth gets hotter. I talked to Andrew Pershing at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute.
So we've actually had 3 major heat waves in the Gulf of Maine, 2012, 2016, and 2018, and repeat heat waves in the North Pacific. Australia's had some repeat heat waves. So it's really becoming a part of the conversation in oceanography.
And this is wild, right now there's actually a marine heat wave forming off the west coast of the U.S. It's about 4 degrees Celsius warmer than usual. That's about 7 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a big enough difference that you'd notice it if you touched the water.
It would actually feel hotter, yeah.
Exactly.
When we have heat waves in U.S. cities, sometimes people die. People who are elderly, people who are sick, they can be dangerous. So that makes me wonder, what does this mean for animals that live in the ocean?
Yeah, it can be really bad for animals. And the effects ripple through the system. You know, the ocean is a complex place. Things are interconnected. So it goes from little stuff all the way up to big stuff, all the way to humans. I actually spoke with Noah Oppenheim. He's a former marine researcher himself. He's the executive director now of the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations.
The impacts to the ocean sort of cascade up through the food web, starting with plankton and into the krill, which form the prey base for animals as small as sardines, all the way up to salmon and then whales.
So it knocks everything out of equilibrium. That's already happened in the Pacific Northwest. Dungeness crabs, salmon. There have been 2 federal fisheries disasters in the last few years. It's one of the many economic challenges from climate change.
And Rebecca Hersher, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Today, we may learn more about President Trump's overseas effort to gain dirt on a political opponent. The Director of National Intelligence testifies before a House committee.
That's right. Lawmakers have questions about a whistleblower inside of the government. That person filed a complaint with the Intelligence Community's Inspector General, and that complaint moved the House of Representatives to start an impeachment inquiry. Now, this story is moving very quickly, so here's a recap of what we know. President Trump suspended military aid to Ukraine this year. Then he called Ukraine's president. Notes of that conversation show the president repeatedly asked for information about Democrat Joe Biden. The release of this phone call came yesterday as Trump and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky met at the UN, and Zelensky said he didn't feel pushed by Trump.
We had, I think, good phone call. It was normal. We spoke about many things, and so I think, and you read it, that nobody pushed me. Yes.
In other words, no pressure.
You hear President Trump at the end there making his view clear. No pressure, he says. NPR's Tim Mack begins our coverage. Tim, good morning.
Good morning.
So when I read these 5 pages, I guess Zelensky is not completely incorrect. They discussed a number of things, but it does seem the essence of the call is Joe Biden. Trump congratulates Zelensky on winning election. They discuss ambassadors. And then Trump says the U.S. supports Ukraine, but Ukraine is not necessarily reciprocating. And then what?
So the Ukrainian president indicates interest in more U.S. military aid, specifically his interest in the future in purchasing Javelin anti-tank missiles from the United States. Mm-hmm. Immediately after this, the president says a memorable line, quote, "I would like you to do us a favor, though." In the conversation that follows, President Trump urges Ukraine's leader to work with Rudy Giuliani and Attorney General William Barr, and he asks the president of Ukraine to investigate unsubstantiated rumors about Joe Biden and his son.
Now, how is President Trump defending himself when, and this is a document released by the White House, when he is on the record there, asking Zelensky again and again to investigate Biden and says, get in touch with my personal lawyer about this?
So Trump's immediate reaction has been to label the Democratic response as an overreach. Here's what the president said yesterday afternoon at the United Nations.
When they look at the information, it's a joke. Impeachment for that? When you have a wonderful meeting or you have a wonderful phone conversation?
You know, the president almost seems to view this transcript as complimentary to him. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that the White House is the body that put out this document. Republicans have also argued that there's no explicit quid pro quo in the transcript, that the president did not directly condition U.S. military aid to Ukraine launching an investigation.
They just talked about U.S. aid, and then he asked for a favor. I mean,
right.
They didn't actually have a verb that connects them, but they're right there.
The sequence of events actually does suggest a quid pro quo, but Democrats will say that even if there wasn't a direct exchange outline, the president still asked a foreign leader to disrupt a potential 2020 opponent, and that's wrong.
Okay, so this conversation, or the notes of this conversation, this is part, but maybe not all, of a whistleblower complaint. What has happened with that?
So the whistleblower complaint was just released to Congress Wednesday afternoon. It's private right now, but here's what House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff said yesterday after he reviewed it behind closed doors.
I found the allegations deeply disturbing. I also found them very credible. I can understand why the Inspector General found them credible, even without the benefit yet of the Inspector General's full analysis.
Oh, the Inspector General, that's the person who received this whistleblower complaint. Go on.
That's right. Schiff also said that the complaint provided information for the committee to follow up on, and that the content seemed to escalate this beyond the president's call with the Ukrainian leader, that there are other topics that might be involved at all, also in the whistleblower complaint for further review.
We know how upset Democrats are. What are Republicans saying?
Well, the president's staunchest supporters are holding the line, but there are some moderate Republicans like Senators Ben Sasse and Mitt Romney who are expressing alarm at this scandal.
Tim, thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
That's NPR's Tim Mack. Now, who is the intelligence official at the center of the inquiry today?
Joseph Maguire is new in the job of Director of National Intelligence. He became acting director when he replaced Dan Coats. Now, Coats was a former senator. He's well known in Washington for his quiet independence from the president, but we know less about Joseph Maguire.
So NPR's Jackie Northam has been looking into his past. Jackie, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
How did he end up being the person who is acting Director of National Intelligence?
Well, Joseph Maguire stepped into a tough job, as you just mentioned. He replaced the previous DNI, Dan Coates, who resigned and had tussled with President Trump, who is critical of the intelligence community. The White House forced out Coates' deputy as well, and so Maguire was appointed as DNI. He was not nominated to the job. He is 67 years old. He's a career Navy officer and retired as a 3-star admiral. His entire career was spent in special operations. He was a Navy SEAL. So this world of national secrets is not new to him. His most recent job before DNI was Director of National Counterterrorism Center. From all accounts, Maguire is well respected, but he's only been in the job in an acting capacity for just over a month.
Okay, so career professional, but there at the president's pleasure even more so, and not yet confirmed by the Senate. What has his role been in this story?
Well, he's got a critical role, By the time he received the whistleblower report, as we mentioned earlier, the Inspector General of the intelligence community had already reviewed it and found it to be both credible, and urgent. At that point, by law, Maguire was really just supposed to pass the report on to Congress, but he decided to seek legal advice. And he referred the whistleblower's report to the Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel, which determined that it didn't fall under Maguire's jurisdiction as DNI and that he did not need to send it to Congress. And, Steve, ever since the whistleblower's controversy blew up, Maguire has come under enormous scrutiny. And many Democrats, have been accusing him of covering up the report, protecting the administration.
How has he responded?
Well, a couple of days ago, Maguire issued a statement saying he wanted to make it clear that he upheld his responsibility to follow the law every step of the way and that he was committed to protecting whistleblowers and making sure each complaint is handled properly. And he'll have an opportunity, to make that point when he meets with Congress.
What has he said about news reports suggesting that he was trying to be independent from the president and even made a threat?
Well, the Washington Post issued a report saying, based on current and former U.S. officials, that Maguire had threatened to resign if he was constrained in any way from testifying. Immediately after that story appeared, Maguire put out a very strong statement denying it. The Post editor, Marty Barron, says they stand by their story.
Jackie, thanks.
Thanks, Steve.
That's NPR's Jackie Northam. Now, a big part of this story is the almost $400 million in military aid from the United States to Ukraine. The White House earlier this year blocked that aid.
And President Trump's request to investigate Joe Biden came only days later. So why did the president freeze the money? In the past couple of days, he has given some conflicting accounts. Here he is on Monday saying that the delay was about corruption.
We want to make sure that country is honest. It's very important to talk about corruption. If you don't talk about corruption, why would you give money to a country that you think is corrupt? One of the reasons the new president got elected is he was going to stop corruption.
And then a day later, the president said the delay was about other countries not paying their share.
My complaint has always been, and I'd withhold again, and I'll continue to withhold until such time as Europe and other nations contribute to Ukraine, because they're not doing it. It's the United States. We're putting up the bulk of the money. And I'm asking, why is that?
So different explanations from the president, and we have reporting this morning that seems to undercut them. NPR's David Welna is on the line. David, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
So what is the letter that you obtained from the U.S. military?
So this was a letter sent by the Pentagon to the chairman of 4 congressional committees in May. It came from Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, John Rood. And in it, he certifies to these committees, as he's required by law, that Ukraine has undertaken sufficient reforms for decreasing corruption and increasing accountability in order to qualify for some $250 billion in security assistance from the Pentagon to help Ukraine defend itself against a pro-Russia separatist insurgency. In essence, the Pentagon was telling Congress that corruption was not a reason to hold up that money, which, as it turns out, is quite at odds with what President Trump has been saying.
Yeah, the president has said this is all about corruption. Of course, his critics have noted the only alleged corruption that he seemed to be interested in was this several years old and largely discredited story that happens to involve his political opponent. But you're saying the Pentagon, so the administration itself, in effect, and the career military people looked at this and said Ukraine is actually improving the issue of corruption. So the president perhaps knowing this, I don't know, changed his explanation, said it was really about being upset that the U.S. was paying too much and European allies are not paying. Is there information about that explanation?
Right. So if he's withholding this money because European allies aren't kicking in their fair share, you would think his administration would be leaning on those countries to do more. So I checked with more than half a dozen European embassies here in Washington to see if they'd been pressured to increase their contributions to Ukraine. And not one of them reported anything of the kind. In fact, several pointed out that the European Union has already given Ukraine $15 billion in economic assistance, which is about 10 times as much as the U.S. has provided Ukraine in security over the past 5 years.
I just want to be clear on this, David Welna. It sounds like you listened to the president, you looked into what he had to say, and both of his explanations have fallen apart. Is that saying too much?
I don't think that's saying too much. They certainly don't stand up to a lot of scrutiny. And Trump is facing accusations that the real purpose for withholding this aid was to pressure Ukrainian President Zelensky into conducting an investigation into the affairs of Joe Biden and his son Hunter. So this could get quite interesting before Congress.
David, thanks so much for your reporting. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Steve.
That's NPR's David Welna.
It is just 7 pages long, but it could change the course of a presidency. An unclassified version of the whistleblower complaint is now public.
Yeah, and the second sentence in this complaint basically lays it all out. It says, quote, "In the course of my official duties, I have received information from multiple U.S. government officials that the President of the United States is using the power of his office to solicit interference from a foreign country in the 2020 U.S. election." Now, during a July phone call, President Trump asked the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden. This complaint also alleges that White House officials put details of this phone call onto a classified server because they were worried about the political implications.
We've got a team of reporters covering this story. We begin with NPR's Ryan Lucas, who has been reading the whistleblower complaint closely. Hi, Ryan.
Good morning.
What's important to understand about what's laid out here in the complaint?
Well, the first thing is this complaint raises the allegation that President Trump pressured the Ukrainian president in a phone call to investigate Joe Biden and Biden's son. And what the whistleblower says in the complaint basically matches what we saw in the account of the call released this week by the White House. But the big headline to come out of this complaint is that the White House allegedly tried to hide evidence of Trump's conversation with the Ukrainian president because officials were worried about what had gone down on the call. The complaint says that White House officials tried to, quote, lock down all records of the phone call. The whistleblower says that White House lawyers ordered the electronic transcript of the call be removed from the computer system where these transcripts are typically kept, and then had it placed instead on a separate system used for highly classified, highly sensitive national security-related materials. And that's despite the fact that this call did not contain national security materials.
Right, and we're going to dig further into what that means in a few moments. But let's talk about the implications of all this. There are lots of details in the complaint, but the author of the complaint says right up front that it's not his or her firsthand information. It's information from, quote, multiple U.S. government officials. Republicans are seizing on this, right?
Republicans have pushed that line. We heard that up on the Hill in testimony yesterday before the House Intelligence Committee. But as you said, the whistleblower is upfront that most of this information is not firsthand. He or she, because remember, we don't know the identity of this individual, says outright that they were not a direct witness to most of the events. But the whistleblower says the information comes from more than a half dozen U.S. officials. Some of them are folks in the White House. And the complaint says that those officials relayed these accounts, the accounts of these events and details of them to the whistleblower in the course of regular, very high-level government business. And the whistleblower says that he or she found them credible because the accounts were largely consistent with one another, and there were multiple people providing this information. So it wasn't just a rumor that they heard from one person and were then running with.
Right, and we should say again, the ICIG, the Inspector General for the Intelligence Committee, viewed this to be credible enough to elevate it.
And the account of the call matches the account of the call in the complaint.
So now we've got Nancy Pelosi opening an impeachment inquiry. As far as we understand, the same committees, Intelligence, Justice, others are still going to be looking into President Trump. What are you looking for? I mean, what is the next step in all this?
Well, there are a lot of breadcrumbs in the whistleblower's report for congressional investigators to follow. Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, has said this is basically a roadmap. There are a dozen or so officials who listened in on the president's call with the Ukrainian leader, according to the complaint. Lawmakers will want to talk to them. There are the White House officials and lawyers who were allegedly involved in moving the transcript. They will want to be talked to. There are the big names, Attorney General William Barr, President's personal attorney Rudy Giuliani. Those are people who they'll want to talk to. And, of course, a whistleblower himself or herself. The committees are working to get access to that individual as well.
Lots more hearings. NPR's Ryan Lucas, thanks. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, so as we mentioned, this phone call took place between President Trump and the president of Ukraine. The whistleblower complaint alleges that the transcript itself of that call was handled in a troubling way.
Right. The whistleblower says that the record of the call was put into what's known as a code word level system. Now, that's used for the highest level of classified intelligence, and it's only accessible to a very small, restricted circle of people.
NPR's White House reporter Aisha Roscoe is with us this morning to talk about this. Hi, Aisha.
Good morning.
What can you tell us about how this system works?
So there are different classification systems, and what seems to be referred to in the complaint would be this compartment within the category of top secret information. This system is in place for the Trump administration, according to a former NSC official who worked under Trump. What's key about this system is that only select people in the administration would have access to it. This official told NPR's Franco Ordonez that only about 4 to 6 people in the White House likely had access. And information stored there is shared in person, not over unsecured phone lines or through email.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, Aisha, did you say this is a system that was set up explicitly for the Trump administration?
No. This system has been in place in prior administrations, but it's still in place because obviously systems can change. So I just wanted to clarify that this is still in place for the Trump administration.
Okay, so you've been talking with some former national security officials about what we now understand are the allegations in the whistleblower complaint. What are you hearing from them?
So they're saying that an action like this is really unheard of during their times in the NSC. Phone calls between the president and world leaders are typically classified, but they're not treated in this manner, which is reserved for like intelligence programs or tools the U.S. wouldn't want other countries to know about. I spoke with Michael Green, who worked at the NSC for about 5 years during the Bush administration, and he pointed out this was after 9/11, and this is what he had to say about his experience with these calls.
Even in that context, I had never heard or witnessed what we're seeing now, where a transcript was routed directly to the most sensitive compartmented security clearances so that no one could see it.
And so because of that, he said he found these allegations pretty disturbing. Ned Price worked at the NSC during the Obama administration. He said he never heard of anyone taking any actions like this during his time there. He pointed out that the idea that this information would need to be stored on a separate system is undercut because the administration released the unredacted notes on the call. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't appear to be classified information.
So, Aisha, we still don't know the identity of the whistleblower. Neither does the president, but that's not stopping him from trying to undermine this person's credibility. What's he saying?
Yeah, at a private event in New York with U.S. diplomatic officials, President Trump really went after this whistleblower and anyone who might have talked to them. Or here's what he had to say.
You know what we used to do in the old days when we were smart, right? With spies and treason. We used to handle it a little differently than we do now.
And so you have it. That's pretty dark statement from the president. But this is what he's saying in the aftermath of this complaint coming out.
And we should also just underscore the fact that his acting director of national intelligence, Joseph McGuire, testified under oath in front of Congress that the whistleblower has done everything right and has followed and abided by all U.S. laws. Aisha Roscoe, thanks. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, let's switch gears. We're going to focus now on Egypt. Because that is the sound of the streets of Cairo, where anti-government protests have been taking place in recent days. Protesters demanding that the president there, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, resign.
The crackdown on these protests has been harsh, even by Egypt's standards, which are not great. A human rights group there says almost 2,000 people have been arrested since these protests started last weekend. Now, despite that, the guy who's leading the protests is calling for 1 million people to come out and march today.
Jared Mawson is a Middle East correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and is in Cairo, joins us this morning. Jared, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Why are people so angry with the president?
Well, this is a regime where there's no real freedom of speech, where street protests are all but illegal, where this government has a well-documented record of torture, and where, because of this government's economic policies, the standard of living has really declined over the last several years. And so, you know, the president, Sisi, has been facing some new allegations of corruption in recent days that have just sparked a lot of resentment that has been there under the surface for years.
One of the things that was so memorable about the revolution 8 years ago was how much it is animated by social media. Is that happening again?
Yeah, this has a lot to do with social media in the sense that these protests were in response to a series of online videos that were posted by a man named Muhammad Ali, who identified himself as a contractor for the government, who was involved in building these massive construction projects that have been sort of the signature of this government's program over the last few years. And among those projects were these lavish palaces for the president. And these allegations, you know, that the government is wasting public funds on these palaces while ordinary Egyptians are struggling to make ends meet, feed their families, and dealing with increases in the prices of basic goods. That's really struck a chord with people, and these videos went viral, and it's become a real phenomenon in Egyptian social media, and it spilled into the street in the real world last week.
How big a threat is this to El-Sisi? Jared?
Hello? Yep.
How big a threat is this to El-Sisi and his role?
It's very hard to predict, but the government is behaving as if it's a crisis. As you mentioned, they've arrested more than 2,000 people over the last week, which is the largest single roundup of political opponents we've seen since Sisi came to power. So, you know, even in the context of a massive crackdown over the last few years, it's really striking to see that many people arrested. And it's very hard to say how this is all going to play out in the streets. And we have to see how many people show up to these protests today.
Jared Mawson of the Wall Street Journal in Cairo. Thank you. We appreciate it.
President Trump spent much of the weekend on Twitter. Tweets from the president's account denounced his critics or shared videos of his supporters more than 80 times.
Yeah, the president was sending messages as Democrats prepare hearings for an impeachment inquiry. House leaders have indicated that they want this examination to move fairly quickly. It would focus on the president's call to Ukraine asking for an investigation of his political opponent, Joe Biden. Yesterday, Adam Schiff, the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, was asked on ABC how soon he might hear from the whistleblower who revealed the call. And here's what he said.
Very soon. It will depend probably more on how quickly the Director of National Intelligence can complete the security clearance process for the whistleblower's lawyers. But we're ready to hear from the whistleblower as soon as that is done.
NPR White House correspondent Tamara Keith is with us this morning. Tam, good morning.
Good morning.
How serious is this challenge to the president?
It's serious. Democrats are taking this investigation very seriously in the House. Now, of course, he still has a Republican-controlled Senate, and that means that even if the House were to impeach the president, at this point, it seems quite unlikely that he would be removed by the Senate. But there are cracks. Tom Bossert, who's a former Homeland Security advisor to the president, said on ABC this weekend that he was deeply disturbed by what President Trump said on the call with the president of Ukraine. And that's notable because Bossert isn't a random guy. He worked closely with the president in the White House, though he also argued that on its own, the call wasn't impeachable. And that's what I'm hearing from multiple people close to the White House, is that they actually consider the call improper, but not impeachable.
Oh, which is different from what the president has repeatedly said when he has called the call a perfect phone conversation. How is the president defending himself?
Well, in one of the many tweets you mentioned, he accused a member of Congress of treason and said he wanted access to the whistleblower. Another one quoted someone as saying impeachment would lead to civil war. These are extreme even by the standards of President Trump, and also way outside of the norms of past presidential conduct. During the last impeachment in 1998, the Clinton White House had a war room. People focused on fighting impeachment so that the rest could stay focused on policy. Out in the White House driveway on Friday, Kellyanne Conway was asked about whether the Trump White House would be setting up a war room.
Why would he do that? Who started the war here? He's the most battle-tested person I've ever met. Why do we need an impeachment war room when the other people have the burden of showing why they're impeaching the president?
In terms of communications, at least, the White House is pretty sparsely staffed right now, even compared to earlier in the Trump administration, much less in other administrations, and much less a White House that is now facing an existential crisis.
Nevertheless, we clearly have the White House focused on this, if the 80 tweets from the president's personal account are any indication. But who will be backing up the president to defend him?
A really big part of this is going to be the campaign. No president has faced impeachment while also running for re-election. And what that means is that there already is a war room. There is literally a Twitter account called the Trump War Room, set up by the Trump campaign. There's a surrogate operation, rapid response research, that's all there. And over the weekend, the Trump campaign began a $10 million ad buy.
Okay, Tamara, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
There'll be so much more to say about this. That's NPR's Tamara Keith. The U.S. State Department is still investigating Hillary Clinton's emails.
This very toxic issue overshadowed the 2016 presidential election. So as a reminder, the FBI started looking at the former Secretary of State's use of a private email server back in 2015. A year later, James Comey, who was then the director of the FBI, announced that the case should be closed with no charges. But now the Washington Post is reporting that the matter isn't dead. The Trump administration is said to be investigating dozens of current and former State Department officials for what they sent to Secretary Clinton, and that some of their emails have even been retroactively classified.
The Washington Post's Greg Jaffe is among the team of reporters who broke this story. He's on the line. Greg, good morning.
Good morning.
How widespread is this investigation?
You know, it's about 130 or 140 people, and it hits people kind of at all levels of the State Department, from, relatively senior or very senior positions like assistant secretaries of state down to anyone who might have passed emails that landed in Hillary Clinton's private email.
I'm trying to make sure I understand the essence of the question here. The question is basically asking various current and former diplomats, why did you send information to Hillary Clinton's private email server?
What happens is they find the emails on the server. They've gone through these kind of millions of emails and determined that a certain number contained classified information. And then they go back and ask people, why did you send this improperly classified email to Hillary Clinton? In virtually all the cases, they're retroactively classified. So they're people passing information they thought was unclassified that's later determined to be classified.
Retroactively classified. How much trouble can you be in for sending retroactively classified information you could not possibly have known was classified at the time?
Yeah, and I think there's valid debate about whether it should even be classified today. I think people were worried that it could impact their future. Most of these people are out of government, and that it could make it harder if they come back in government to get a security clearance. That's the essence of their worry.
Greg, do you have any sense, either from the investigators or those being investigated, as to what would be driving the State Department to look so closely into this matter years later?
It's really hard to say. I don't have a great sense. They'll say that they're just doing business as usual, that this is an investigation that dates back to the end of the Obama administration, and they're just completing it now. But as to why they're doing it now, I think, their argument is that they're doing their duty, that there was classified information found in Hillary Clinton's email, and they need to investigate it. I think others feel like this is sort of a form of low-level harassment.
Well, that's my question. Do the people being investigated think that they're targets of some kind of political attack?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think they feel like, it's an effort to harass them, an effort to put things in their file that in the future could make it significantly harder for them to get a security clearance.
So nobody's going to be prosecuted for this, probably, but it would go on their permanent record, so to speak.
It could go on their permanent record. And most of the people have gotten letters saying that, the security incidents in which they're involved are valid, but they're not culpable. That's if they cooperated. If they didn't cooperate, it gets a little bit more complicated.
Greg, thanks for your reporting.
Yeah, thank you.
That's Greg Jaffe of the Washington Post, and he spoke with us on Skype. Okay, this is what the 17th week of pro-democracy demonstrations sounded like in Hong Kong. We will hear the protesters confronting police now.
Yesterday, tear gas rose over major government and shopping areas. People threw bricks at the police, and authorities hit the crowds with water cannons. Now, these demonstrations come at a really important time, just before China's National Day. That is the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China.
NPR's Julie McCarthy is in Hong Kong. Hi there, Julie.
Hi, Steve.
How did the protests unfold over the weekend?
Well, Sunday's big event was billed as a march against global totalitarianism. 60 other cities had marches like this, but here the demonstrators brandished banners about China that read evil dictatorship, and they chanted slogans certain to irritate Beijing.
Free Hong Kong! Free Hong Kong! Democracy now! Democracy now! Fight for freedom!
And the day was more violent than usual. Demonstrators set scores of street fires, volleys of tear gas and rubber bullets chased them from one street to the next. This went on for hours, and residents came down from their apartments in their slippers to see what the action was all about, some hurling insults at the police. We found a young student from France huddled in an alcove, crying, and had to escort her back to her hotel. It was that kind of a day.
Wow. Now, what is the significance of the timing here? That anniversary that Noel mentioned?
Well, it does come on all of this tense weekend comes right on the heels or is leading up to this big day in China. And here there is deep antagonism toward mainland China over what they say, over what Hong Kong says, is Beijing not living up to an agreement that was supposed to preserve Hong Kong's freedoms for 50 years. Instead, they see Beijing creeping into their everyday lives, requiring a kind of fealty to China. And when I ask protesters, what does the 70th anniversary of the founding of the PRC mean to you? To a person, Steve, they said, nothing. 24-year-old Origa Wong elaborated on that.
We lack the sense of belonging to China. We inherited a system different from China. So regarding the 70th anniversary, we don't have a special feeling.
No special feeling. They inherited a British system, and Wong says, look, Hong Kong has this core values that rely on democracy and rule of law and liberty. And these are liberties that no city in mainland China enjoys. Hong Kongers know it, and they're jealously guarding these freedoms. They don't want them eroded, and that is what these protests are about.
I'm just thinking, though, this 70th anniversary is a huge deal for mainland China, and here it comes. So how are protesters likely to mark it?
Well, they were going to mark it really with counter commemorations. The court this afternoon denied the umbrella human rights group, the Civil Front, a police permit to march, but that doesn't stop protesters here. The fireworks over the harbor were canceled, and the flag-raising ceremony has been moved indoors to, quote, ensure it can be held in an orderly, solemn manner. But I don't expect much will be orderly or solemn in Hong Kong tomorrow.
Julie, thanks very much for the update.
Thank you.
NPR's Julie McCarthy is in Hong Kong.